So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Actually, you know who's not here? Tracy. I'll have to check in with her. But thank you all for jumping online. It's a really really important for you all to hear from 55.5 and the purpose of the research paper that we undertook earlier this year. So 55.5 are an independent market research organisation, and they've conducted, this is the second research paper that they have conducted for our organisation. The first one they actually won a prestigious award for. That's how amazing it was. They're going to take you through some of the key findings of our latest report with a focus on the CTP and the judicial process. So the idea is just to walk you through it so you get a really high level understanding of what it's all about. So I'm going to introduce you to Belinda, Lauren, and is Bella on?
Yes, Bella's here.
Yep, perfect. And they will take you all through. If you've got any questions, there should be a chat box there. You can pop it in, or we'll leave it to the end and you can ask.
Perfect. Thanks, Katie.
I'm going to mute myself.
All good. Can I just check if my screen share is working okay? Can you guys see the slides? Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. And firstly, thank you so much for having us here with you this evening. Bella and Lauren and myself are really privileged to work with the Road Trauma Support Group and to work on this research piece. It's a delight to be able to be here this evening and take you through our recent findings and what we've shared with the CTP and judicial industries. Just this week and last week, we've done a couple of webinars presenting back our findings, which has been awesome to see them engaging with us. And we're just pleased to be able to share it with you today as well. We heard early on in this piece when Duncan first approached us that unfortunately a lot of the trauma that's experienced when people lose a loved one to a fatal road crime just often goes unheard. The stories aren't told, no one's talking about it. We're not giving this huge problem the attention that it deserves. So we're really privileged to be able to conduct this research, collect the stories, hear what's happening and present it back to industry and really try and get some changes made. There's so much that needs to change, as I'm sure you're all aware. So it's great that we're able to be part of that. I'm just going to quickly do an acknowledgement of country before we move into the results. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting today. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, which is the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I know many of you are joining us from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay respect to the traditional owners and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and community. And I'd like to extend my respects to elders, both past and present, and any First Nations people who are joining us here today. So just in terms of what we'll cover off this evening, so I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes up front just taking you through the background to the research, how we've conducted it, the methods we used, etc. And then I'll talk to you a bit about the scale and impact of criminal road trauma. We've been lucky to collect some statistics that haven't existed before until this research was done and really illuminate the full scale of this issue and the impact that it has on our people and our community. I'm then going to hand to Bella, who's going to take us through the CTP results that we presented to industry last week, with a focus on what we've really encouraged them to consider, things that need to change or things that need to be improved. And then I'll hand to Lauren, who's going to do the same thing for judicial. And I'll come back towards the end and just take you through a brief overview of what we've been able to do so far with the research and what we've been able to change as a result of the research. And we do have time for questions. We're very happy to take questions. So please feel free to drop them in the chat box. We can keep track of them as we go and make sure we open up for discussion and questions at the end. And just an acknowledgement, we always start these presentations with this acknowledgement. Bella and Lauren and myself have not personally experienced the impact of road trauma, which means that our findings in this research are purely based on the stories of people who've been generous enough to share them with us. There might be some of you on the call who've been part of this research, whether in an interview or doing our survey this year or last year, and we just simply could not do it without you and really want to reiterate our heartfelt thanks for your participation and for everyone who's participated in this research. We know that telling the intricate details of your experiences over and over again is really difficult and traumatic, and we are so grateful for everyone who has done that with us, taken us through their experiences. We simply couldn't do this research without it, so just a heartfelt thank you from us. All right, just a brief introduction to the research. I know Katie's taken you through a little bit of the background, but essentially Duncan and the team came to us about 2 years ago and they said, we've all been through the most horrific experiences you can ever imagine. There is so much that needs to change, and we know that very full well, but we need evidence. We need some evidence we can take to government, take to decision makers and say, look, this is not just individual stories. This is a huge problem. We need your attention. We need to do something to fix what is so broken and wrong in so many ways. So they came to us and said, can you do some research and help us prove what needs to change? So we've done 2 rounds of research so far. So we did a report last year, and one's just come out in the last couple of weeks as well, that brings together a range of perspectives in the community to really illuminate the full reality of the experience, what fatal road crimes do to people, what's happening in our communities, what needs to change. And really the intention is to identify what things need to change and really drive that change in action. So a bit of an advocacy focus. So the way we've done the research so far is a couple of methods. So looking at existing literature. When Duncan first came to us, RTSG was quite a new organisation, and we had a lot to learn to get established. So we started by looking at what exists in other jurisdictions, what's happening with road safety in other locations, how people who are victims of road trauma supported, etc., just to really give us an idea of what already exists that we could build on. And then we've done a few rounds of qualitative research or interviews with affected families. So we've had nearly 25 people who've shared quite lengthy detail of their experiences with us, which we know is difficult, but is so important to really help us understand really what goes on from the moment that you're notified of the crash to even present day, really giving us rich information about the experiences and detail of what really needs to change to improve the support offered to families. We've also spoken to experts, so we know there's sort of 2 sides to every story. We've spoken to experts like in police, in lawyers, first responders, crash investigators, etc., just to understand their perspective on what's happening, why things are the way they are, what are some of the things that restrict them from doing what they would love to be able to do to support people, etc., just to help us understand kind of what we're up against when we're trying to make change in these areas. And we've also done quite a large-scale online survey, 2 rounds of that research. Over 4,000 people have done our survey across all parts of the community, people who have experienced loss due to fatal road crimes and people who haven't, etc., across the full spread, just to give us a really, really strong, robust evidence base that we can take to government and say, look, we've got a huge amount of data here to support our findings. You need to take this seriously. You need to make some changes. So we're really proud and privileged, like I said before, to be part of this. This is the first and only kind of its research in Australia, which it's great that we're doing it, but it's a real shame that we're not doing it elsewhere. This issue needs more attention and to be talked about more often, as I'm sure you all know. So the research reports are available on the RTSG website if you're interested in reading more. They're a little bit lengthy. They're a little bit over 100 pages because we've got a lot to say, but they're quite engaging, and hopefully, if you're interested, you can have a look and see the full detail of what we found. Just before I get into some of the results, I just want to make a quick pause here just to acknowledge that one of the things we heard really clearly throughout all the interviews and all the survey data is that every person who's impacted by road trauma has a very different experience. It's different depending on your relationship to the person who was killed, based on your own age, where you live, what you're doing for work, what support you have for family, from friends, what support you get from people like DPP or others involved in other industries, etc., how much the media gets involved. All these factors really influence what the experience is like. So one of the things we've tried to do with this research is sort of summarize the key themes, the key things that we keep hearing over and over again that are going to allow us to point to things that need to change, that are going to help the most people. So although you might hear some things tonight that you agree with or don't agree with, that resonate with you or don't resonate with you, that's okay. We've captured all the richness and we've kind of summarized back what are the key themes. So hopefully you will recognize your own experience in some of this, but if you don't recognize it in other things, that's okay. We know it's very different for everyone. Just wanted to make that point before we get into the results. All right, I'll just take you through some statistics now. The statistics are obviously numbers and they're a little bit dry, but we will get into a bit more richness behind them in just a moment. But one of our first challenges was to just describe the scale of this issue on our community. How big is this issue? The government doesn't keep track of fatal road crimes. They keep track of deaths on the roads, but not fatal road crimes. And if the government's not keeping track of something, we all know they're not doing anything about it. So we said, all right, well, that's not good enough. We'll start collecting some data ourselves that really illustrates the size and scale of this issue. So this data didn't exist until we did this research, which we're quite proud of and want to share far and wide. So I'll just take you through a couple of layers here on this chart. So if we look at the adult population in New South Wales, there's about 6.5 million adults. 22.5% of them know someone who's been killed on our roads, which is a huge number. It's 1.5 million people, and certainly was really shocking to us when we first heard this. Like, this is a significant issue. This is affecting, nearly 1 in 4 people in our community, and it's not talked about in those terms. It's not talked about with the gravity that it deserves, given how big of an issue this is. So, first thing we wanted to do was talk about how many people are impacted by road crashes or fatalities. And then if you drill down further, again, these numbers didn't exist, the government doesn't track this, there are nearly 300,000 people in our community who've lost someone to a fatal road crime, which again is a huge number. It's incredibly concerning, very startling to see how big of an issue this is in our community. And just the bottom layer of that sort of ripple there is people who've lost a close friend or close family member because of someone else's criminal activity on our roads, nearly 200,000 people. So I think the government talks about like the road toll, which is kind of a disgusting word, but they use the word toll, the road toll, to talk about the number of deaths on the roads. But what they don't talk about is actually the family and friends and communities who are all impacted by these deaths. It's not an individual number, it's a huge number of people who are affected by every single one of them. So we wanted to just change the way we talk about the toll, quote unquote, and actually talk about the impact of this issue, the size and scale of it, because it is much bigger, as you can see from these numbers, than the simple road toll statistics would suggest. And unfortunately, the road toll is unfortunately going up. Last year was the first time that we've had 3 years consistently of the road toll increasing since 1970. So we've made huge progress since the 70s. That's now coming undone because the road toll is going up. And what that means is that the number of people who are affected by those deaths, again, is increasing. So an increase year on year of nearly 11% of people who know someone who's been killed on our roads, nearly a 12% increase in those who lost someone to a fatal road crime, and a similar increase for those who've lost a close friend or family. So we're taking these numbers to government and saying, this is a huge issue. You're not talking about it. This is very significant, and you need to do more to improve what's happening, to reduce deaths, but also to improve what happens to people, families, once they do experience a loss of a loved one, and the systems and processes they get shoved into from the moment of the crash. It also means, because these numbers are on the rise, that the number of people going through CTP, for example, or going through the court process is increasing. So it's, again, further evidence that we need to do more to change those systems and processes and make sure we're supporting people as they go through them, not making their experience worse, causing secondary trauma, which is so often the case, unfortunately. In addition to the stats, we also wanted to capture, I guess, to try and measure what the impact of the crash is on someone's life, which is a really hard thing to do. When you boil it down, a crash like this or a fatality like this impacts every aspect of life. Nothing is the same anymore. The impacts are huge, catastrophic, and they're long lasting as well. So we've seen things like, for those who've lost someone in the last 10 years, significant number experiencing loss of friendships, decrease in performance at work or study. 1 in 2 have thought about committing suicide, which is just heartbreaking. Mental health challenges, nearly everyone has experienced mental health challenges. So although this data is really difficult to think about and to hear, we just want to share it with you because we want to explain to you what we're taking to government to show what needs to change and how severe this issue is. It needs more attention. It is a significant and catastrophic issue that we're really ignoring. So we're just taking these numbers to government to show evidence for why they need to engage with conversations around what needs to change. In addition to the stats, we're also taking words or quotes or experiences as well. I won't read these out to you, don't need me to read them to you, but we are, taking what has until now been an unheard trauma that goes ignored, and we're really trying to elevate and lift these stories up and advocate for change, because there's so much, as you all know, that's just wrong about the whole system, everything that happens after the crash that we need to change. So we're taking the stats that we've collected and the stories, the feedback or experiences we've heard, and really elevating them to government through our research and through our reporting. So that's just a high level kind of introduction to what we've done. I'm going to hand now to Bella, who's going to take us through some of the CTP results more specifically. This we presented to the industry last week in a webinar. Bella's going to take you through the kind of high level findings and the things that we told the industry that they need to really focus on or change. So over to you, Bella.
And yeah, I just want to pause on that point that you've made. I guess us just trying to reiterate and show those stories. We really wanted the research to emphasize that these are elements that are often enduring and immeasurable, and CTP was, of course, identified as a process that often and repeatedly causes re-traumatization. So I'll be taking you through a bit of a high-level view of the elements of the CTP process that emerged as particularly distressing and widespread. But to Belinda's earlier point, I just want to again recognize that there was such vast variability in the experiences with CTP reported to us, which was a key finding in itself. There's much more detail in the full report, but today I'll focus on echoing back those dominant themes that have emerged as a whole. And again, it's not our intention for anyone to feel like this may not accurately reflect their own individual experience, but rather our hope that the findings help better pinpoint those key opportunities for intervention and support and reform as well. So from a research perspective, we really set out, as Belinda mentioned, not only to measure and quantify those themes that we heard, but also to bring to life the raw experiences, really using the power of human stories. We wanted decision makers to hear firsthand the reality of these experiences. For instance, this quote stands on its own to highlight the sense of CTP, the system, as ineffective, outdated, and cruel. We've also interspersed these stories through every element of the report itself. So if you look in the report, you'll notice that they're peppered throughout. In the instance of CTP, it was particularly important, I guess, that we remained, unbiased as researchers to ensure that these insights are going to be irrefutable and really actionable, but also not to sugarcoat any of the findings in any way. We really hoped that in sharing these stories directly from the source that we could retain the power of that raw insight, but also really give people a voice and shine a spotlight on the reality of the CTP experience for families. Now, there is a lot more in the full report, as I mentioned, and we've really, just for the purposes of today, distilled this down into some prominent themes that emerged. In terms of those key pain points, limitations, or elements of the experience that are causing re-traumatization for those navigating the CTP scheme. So firstly, CTP obviously is oriented towards the rehabilitation of physical injuries, so that treatment and time frame for recovery from mental health trauma is much more unpredictable. It's not linear. It's really different from individual to individual, and it's really difficult to measure as well. So the emotional injuries inflicted really just do not fit in the existing CTP categorizations, and it's clear that the process lacks a suitable pathway for criminal road trauma victims. It treats claims in a very generalized way. It's not fit for purpose. And there's no custom pathway for these unique claims. So the research really aims to reiterate that the actions and expectations of insurers and the support provided really need to reflect how unique these claims are. Language is also identified as a critical factor that has profoundly damaging effect when used incorrectly. We know that the language is entirely incongruent with criminal road trauma, causing repetitive stress and ongoing trauma by labeling these intentional crimes as accidents, yet from the initial claim form, descriptions refer to motor accident injury, and this is repeatedly used at every point of the CTP process. We also heard instances of, insurer call centre staff, claims managers using the term accident in discussions with families, which for many is incredibly offensive. And so, again, it was really important that the research relay this to drive that change in the use of language and how it's used in the CTP scheme. Thirdly, we wanted to stress the highly unique nature of criminal road trauma claims, and so they need to be treated as such. Currently, again, they're treated the same as physical injuries. Customer service reps are not trained in the nuances of criminal road trauma, and this leads to interactions which are insensitive and offensive. So there's this immensely unrealistic expectation that progress to quote unquote recovery is linear, which is just really a flawed concept in these circumstances. Also, families repeating details of the crash to multiple claims managers really highlights that much needed change in the existing CTP process. And finally, the commercial orientation of insurers means that minimum payouts are seen to be prioritised. We heard loud and clear a sense of families feeling queried and interrogated at every step of the claims process, and insurers pushing for more positive results in order to minimise payouts. But the challenging thing is, calculating the value of a life in itself is immeasurable. As we've substantiated throughout the report, the impact is so profound and causes continuous ripples throughout one's life that are just impossible to quantify. Yet these CTP payouts, payments are an essential lifeline to ensure that families don't fall through the cracks, which we've seen happens all too often. And the system, needs to change. As for so many, it's this uphill battle, and it's really inflicting further suffering onto families. The research also calls out the specific elements in the CTP process that cause ongoing re-traumatization. So things like the deadline to initiate the CTP claim is completely insufficient given, for so many, the lack of awareness and the lack of remit for insurers to be making that proactive contact, which, in the UK, that is a thing. We know that there's a precedent for this kind of proactive raising of awareness amongst individuals so that they know what they're entitled to. And there's also a precedent to extend this with victims of a crime defined under the Victims' Rights and Support Act, having 2 years to lodge a claim. So it can be done. Also, the administrative burden, it's completely unnecessary and it's simply inappropriate at such time of emotional devastation. Coping day to day is the priority at this time, not insurance paperwork. The initial assessments, again, were identified as not effective in determining the required support. It's simply just not appropriate to be making a diagnosis before trauma has fully presented, and GPs often don't have specialised training in this area. So that need to provide to sort of prove ongoing injury is nonsensical in this instance, of emotional trauma, and there should be an automatic assumption of grief and loss. The research also exposes the difficulty of accessing appropriate psychological support, especially for minors or those based in regional areas as well. And alongside this, insurers pushing for return to work, which can be psychologically damaging and ultimately be misconstrued as being on the path to recovery and actually reduce potential payouts as well. And finally, the lack of appropriate training for insurers in the nuances of emotional trauma was strongly evident. So together, all of these elements in the CTP scheme create secondary trauma, but also expose clear intervention opportunities. So it kind of brings us to the key considerations we put forward through the report for improving CTP. Firstly, it's about awareness. Many victims not being aware of their entitlements. So really focusing on that proactive approach that places the onus on the insurer or CIRA to contact victims of fatal road crimes, as is done in the UK. And just really ensure that everyone is made aware of their support entitlements as early as possible and they get the guidance and those mechanisms are in place to initiate that support. The lack of specificity is a big one. So just clear, consistent evidence here for a customized approach is really essential. Not this generalized pathway, an automatic placement in a separate CTP pathway with immediate access to psychological support without the need to prove a medical diagnosis. That change of language and terminology, specific training and support for insurer teams, a single point of contact throughout the process, and also wider eligibility definitions as well. The injury definitions, current definitions are really grounded in this physical injury and that need for rehabilitation. Again, they don't take into consideration the psychological and emotional impacts of fatal road crime. So again, there should be automatic classification as a non-threshold injury. There should not be a requirement for families to prove nor justify their grief. And there should be a set amount of entitlements, not a requirement to satisfy the threshold for injury. And contributory negligence should not apply in these events as well. So it's illogical in these circumstances. It doesn't make sense to penalise families in this matter. In terms of the claim lodgement, again, a big part of the researchers' findings is to reduce the burden and this onerous process at such a traumatic time in one's life, plus the overly strict eligibility criteria. So meaning those people who potentially should be getting support and not getting the support that they critically need. So the lodgement process really can be corrected to better reflect the nature of the circumstances, removing the 90-day deadline, introducing potentially a family claim or an umbrella document that eliminates the need for multiple repetitive claims, families having to repeat intimate details over and over again. It's not necessary. Also educating and supporting GPs in making more appropriate diagnoses, or better yet, removing that need for evidence to support the traumatic grief experienced due to the loss of a family member, not requiring it at all in these circumstances, ideally. And finally, the ongoing claims process, again, a really heavy burden on victims. It does really not provide this holistic view of the victim's needs and causes, again, ongoing secondary trauma. So removing that need for medical assessments every 28 days, in allowing that greater engagement with specialised medical professionals, those who have that specific skill set for, this emotional trauma. Creation of the tailored set of metrics and assessment criteria that really accurately reflect the nature of the injuries, severe traumatic grief, not physical injuries. Improving access to face-to-face specialist psychological help as well. And I think it goes without saying, but it should just not be acceptable for insurers to harass either victims or victims' family members or medical professionals, which sadly we heard too often as well. So it's really our hope that these 5 key recommendations are really taken forward to create positive change within the CTP scheme.
Thanks, Bella. I think it's good news that we had good engagement from the industry last week at our webinar. We had Sarah there, we had insurers present. There was about 45 people on the webinar last week. So again, like I mentioned before, we hope that by sharing the stories and experiences widely with people in decision-making power, we can start really rattling the cage and getting some change. I think the number of things that Bella just mentioned that need to change, it's in the last couple of slides, is kind of overwhelming. The system is clearly very, very broken and needs a fundamental rethink if it's going to actually support people as it's supposed to do. CTP is supposed to support people, help people get back to life what was like before the crash, and currently it does the opposite. So Zacharias made a comment around Sarah being useless. We definitely heard that as well. They do seem to be engaging with the research. They came to a presentation we did last year as well as last week. So again, we're hoping by elevating these stories and really having them over the head with how bad things are, we can start to agitate for some change, because there's so much that needs to be fixed, as I'm sure you've experienced or even just heard Bella talk about. Similar problem with judicial, as many of you know. I'm going to hand to Lauren now to take us through the findings that we presented yesterday in a webinar to the judicial industry. Over to you, Lauren.
Linda. So yeah, as Bella's just done, I thought it was important just to mention up front that for the purposes of this session today, we've really focused on bringing to life and highlighting those major dominant themes, but there is plenty of detail in the full report, because the judicial system in particular is an incredibly complex and difficult system to unpack, particularly in light of what we're talking about here. So once again, just to reiterate, we've really pulled up those big major themes that we thought were most pertinent to talk about here, but there's plenty of detail and many more specifics in the full report. So if there are aspects of this where you might be thinking, oh, what about this? It's almost certain that we've covered it in the full report. But I'll take you through some of the big things now. To begin with, I think one of the things that became incredibly clear to us quite early on, and something which was echoed again and again through the people who shared their stories with us, is that part of the biggest problem with the judicial system in terms of how we think about these events and how we think about these crimes is that because a car is involved, they're thought about slightly differently. This was a quote that was shared with us by a person that we interviewed, and I think it perfectly sums up the sentiment that if any other object was used in a way that resulted in somebody dying, that object would become a weapon and the crime would be murder or manslaughter. But when the weapon is a car and the behaviour intentional, these crimes don't seem to be considered homicide. So that notion of the problem being a kind of broader, wider social, cultural issue around mindsets relating to road crimes is a really major theme that we wanted to push really hard in the report, because it massively underpins some of the attitudes and behaviours that we see on our roads that are leading to these situations. So just to kind of begin with that, and I think what we can see on the next slide is how this then plays out and what this means. That ultimately fatal road crimes are not seen in the same light as other criminal activity. And there's a few things that really underpin that and came through incredibly strongly in the research, talking to people about these experiences and what they faced going through the judicial system. Firstly, that they're often described as accidents. As Bella's mentioned, accident is a word that seems to come up again and again and again, whether it's dealing with professionals, the CTP system, throughout the judicial system, anyone in relation to working through the various systems and processes. And we know that accident is categorically incorrect, and it actually frees the criminal driver from culpability, and it minimises the reality and the seriousness of the situation when it's used. And we know that it's used in the media, in documentation, in court proceedings, in conversations with insurers. It's one of the major points that we've hammered home in the report, because what it does across any arena that it's used, but particularly when it's used in a judicial setting, is that it reduces the culpability of the offender, and it softens how the driver's actions are interpreted by people. Accident is much more kind of softer and malleable. It's more palatable as a word to describe the situation, when in fact what we are talking about here is not an accident. This is not an unavoidable mishap. This is the death of a person as a result of the intentional criminal activity of a user of the roads. And so it's something which we believe truly helps underpin and is in some ways pushing this notion that fatal road crimes are not being seen in the same light as other crimes. In addition to this, the fact that most of these types of crimes begin in the local courts means that those punishments are minimal relative to the significance of the crime. They're often treated like traffic offences, which is truly unacceptable given the nature of what we're talking about here. Because local courts are the start point rather than the district or Supreme Court, the limits of what those local courts can impose in terms of sentences means that the maximum of 2 years for a single offence or a maximum of 5 years for a multiple offence is what we're looking at here. And it simply doesn't stack up in light of the significance of the crime that's been committed. But what we can see is that from the very beginning, as people have shared with us, and as is clear from what is happening, is that these fatal road crimes are set up for more lenient sentencing from the very start because of this. Finally, what we again hear loud and clearly is that there's this high frequency of recidivist behaviours. It really shows that there's an ineffective cycle that needs to be broken. Evidence shows that repeat offenders are up to 6 times more likely to be in a serious or fatal road crash than first-time offenders. And this obviously raises some huge questions about the effectiveness of current punishments and rehabilitation. And it really shows us, and it really highlights that more needs to be done to prevent this repeat behaviour. It's a systematic problem, and the way in which our current processes and systems in relation to the judicial process are not setting us up, and we're not setting a strong enough rationale for these behaviours to not be repeated by those offenders. And just referencing that we have boiled this down to some of the big major themes that we heard throughout the research for this session today. But what really bubbled to the surface were 4 really key aspects that are at the core of why families are not just being traumatized by the judicial scheme, but if we think about it, it's ongoing secondary re-traumatization, considering what people are already going through. One of the first aspects is that the support offered to families is incredibly inconsistent. We had major differences in the experience of those going through this system. And it's a complex and unfamiliar world that most people have never even had to consider until they're thrust into it through such an awful and devastating event like this. We did hear some positive stories, which were really nice to hear, particularly from people who had been through this process after the creation of RTSG. We heard that some people were having early access to explanations of the pathway and being prepared for the road that lied ahead, having regular check-ins and being made a lot more aware and comfortable with what was coming. But we know that those instances are incredibly rare and relatively new in terms of what most people experience because of the kind of newness of the organisation. We heard many more stories which were incredibly negative, where people were severely unprepared, really confronted by what they found and discovered, and really frustrated, angry, disappointed with the system. We see really clearly that the people that have had the support of RTSG are absolutely better off to cope with the emotional toll of the trial. But as I've said, those instances appear to be rare, and more needs to be done in order to help make sure that consistency is there and that people are better supported from the very beginning to the very end of this system. The second point that we really wanted to make was that what we see is that the justice system is prioritising the rights of the accused. This was something that was shared with us many times with the people that we interviewed. And it came up in our survey results as well. 7 in 10 families feeling that the offender received better treatment than the court or the offender or their family. And this could look like all sorts of things. We heard stories of people who in their appearances at court, they found that the offender's family were ushered into a private room and seemed to be given special treatment, whereas nothing was offered to them. We've heard stories of flights for offenders and their families being covered from one location to the location of the court, and the families of victims not having the same support offered to them. And this all feels particularly just frustrating when there's overwhelming and undeniable evidence of a crime. We have so much evidence now with technology, blood testing, dash cam footage, CCTV, police reports, witnesses. Yet, despite all of this evidence, which is often overwhelming, it would appear that innocence of the driver is still presumed, and that seems to carry through into the support that they appear to be offered by the court over the support that's offered to victims of families. The court experience is incredibly distressing because what was shared with us is that families are consistently made to feel that they are inferior to the offender and their family, and that's something which is quite simply unacceptable. Thirdly, sentencing is inadequate relative to the crime. current punishments are simply not effective deterrents. We can see that from the number of recidivist behaviours and the high stats in relation to that, but also just the notion that other crimes resulting in death, such as manslaughter, result in jail time, but those convicted of fatal driving related offences often receive much lesser penalties, for example, correctional orders. This has a direct flow and effect of the offenders being charged with lesser crimes, such as negligent driving or dangerous driving, which carry lesser penalties. And we know that in other jurisdictions, such as the UK, such as the USA, they've actually tackled this by changing the charges that can be laid and having more serious charges, which create a more linear and clearer pathway for stronger and harsher sentencing. Fourthly, victim impact statements. They were a major theme that came up in our research, and what we heard is that they're watered down and they're ineffective. Not only are they incredibly traumatic to write and take such bravery to read out loud in a court, we hear that families are finding time and time again that what they write is being altered, edited, they're being told what they can and can't say, and that they're often not able to give that voice of their loved one and to really talk about the impact of what's happened to them. In reality, we know that what this means is that so often all of that time and anguish and pain that is spent into creating those victim impact statements can feel so watered down and like they're nowhere near what was actually intended to be said and what families would like to be saying in court. And ultimately, that's a thing that really needs to change, because they're such vital in order to give families a voice, to give victims a voice, and ensure that those are heard. We heard that at every stage of the process, families are re-traumatised by the system. We heard that despite having killed someone, offenders are usually granted bail. So while in the initial stages of utter shock and devastation, families are informed that the person who broke the law and who killed their loved one is free to go about their life as normal. After that, once charges are laid, entering a protracted process that really draws out pain and suffering. It's incredibly evident, and we hope we've really made it loud and clear in the report that what people expect is a really quick and straightforward trial because there is undeniable evidence, yet instead we're confronted with years of mentions, hearings, sentencing and appeals that often delay the ability of families to heal. Penalties handed down are unfair and inadequate. Monetary fines and community corrections appear to be really common, and they are just inadequate in relation to the scale of what we're talking about here and the severity and the impact of the crimes. It doesn't make sense, and it's completely incongruent with other crimes that result in death. And then finally, as people shared with us, you can go through all of this and it can feel like you're finally reaching the end of this pathway, but then penalties can still be appealed by the convicted driver. So prolonging that agony, you've got more delays, you've got more uncertainty, and it's creating even further re-traumatization. And it's particularly severe when the result of that appeal is that the criminal sentence is reduced. So a system that's absolutely flawed from the start right the way through to the very finish in terms of really providing what is needed in these circumstances. Just waiting for the next page. Oh, there we go.
Over. Sorry, Loz.
You're all good. Thanks, Belinda. So just summing up as Bella did with some of the considerations for improving the justice system. Number one, we really need to address the lack of a dedicated pathway. There is no current distinction between broader traffic offences and fatal road crimes, and it just does not reflect the significance of the crimes committed. It's a critical factor which permeates through so many layers of the judicial system. So We believe, and we hope we've really communicated this in the report, that there needs to be a focused legislation and judicial pathways that relate to fatal road crimes specifically, including a new hierarchy of offences which better reflect the nature of the crimes committed and the impact they have, which will hopefully lead to sentencing, which recognises the magnitude of the offence and is consistent with other crimes resulting in death. A specific review of penalties and rehabilitation for repeat track offenders, because we know right now recidivism is high and that needs to change. Jurisdiction of higher courts for appropriate charges and sentencing, so we can absolutely bypass the limitations of those local courts. And a review of language used. Accent is not accurate, it's not acceptable, and it should not be used in any shape or form in relation to the events that we're talking about here. Second consideration is in terms of that bias to the accused. Families shared with us that they feel the rights and needs of the offender are given precedence over their own and those of their loved one who has been killed. So there's a clear need for a victim-centric approach that provides greater recognition of the impact of fatal road crimes. So this includes addressing that imbalance which seems to favour offenders, for example, the ability to delay trial and sentencing, an expansion of what's allowed in the victim impact statements to allow victims to fully express the impact of the crime, and final summaries to include as much time reflecting on the victim and impact of the crime as the perpetrator. And lastly, addressing the inadequate support. There's a lack of consistent and appropriate support in place for families of victims of fatal road crimes to help them navigate this incredibly complex and convoluted system. So all individuals who are victims of fatal road crime should have equal access to people, tools and support to help them through these proceedings. And this could include a dedicated support person with specific expertise in road trauma cases so they can support in an appropriate way and really help the families to navigate based on an understanding and an empathy of the situation they find themselves in. Provision of clear and detailed information on what to expect from judicial proceedings and when. Access to regular proactive updates on their case, and in-person support during all court appearances where a member of the victim's family is in attendance. That brings us to the end of the summary of the judicial findings. I'm going to hand you back to Belinda to talk a bit about the impact that this has had so far.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lauren. I think I just want to pause and acknowledge that it can be hard to hear some of these research results. I think particularly CTP and judicial are both systems that are just, as many of you know, completely broken, and there's so much that needs to change, and it can feel a bit overwhelming. Zachariah's got the right idea. Let's get this in front of the Law Reform Commission. You know, these sorts of forums where we can share these results are exactly what we want to do. We want to get this research in front of as many people as possible and start getting some things changed. And we wanted to finish with just a quick summary of things that have changed since the first report was done. So the second report's just come out in the last few weeks. It hasn't yet had time to make change in the world, but the first report's been out for a year or year and a half now. And there's a few things that have happened off the back of it, which we're really excited to talk to you about. And they fall into 4 key areas. So just in terms of awareness, the first one, as we've said a few times today, fatal road crimes and the impact of these crimes really until now has gone unheard. The trauma goes unheard. The stories are not being shared. So we have been able to use the research to shine a spotlight on this experience and help it be more understood and more talked about in the community. And we've had widespread media coverage as well. So things like you would have seen on Channel 7 recently, Channel 9, in papers on TV, etc. as well. So the research gives the media something to cling on to and to talk about as we release the results, which is great to see them engaging with this topic and talking about it more broadly. There's been language change within the New South Wales Police, so that word accident is no longer used within the police, which to someone who's not involved in this might sound like a simple change, but as we all know, it's a hugely important change that we get rid of that word. It is these crimes are not accidents, and it's simply wrong to even think of them that way. And there's also been the development of the Australian Road Collision Reporting Guidelines for how we talk about these crashes. Again, not using the word accident. Again, is just part of our efforts to educate the public and educate decision makers around what they're actually doing and what needs to change. In terms of support, so we've helped TSG develop a support strategy, so when, how, and what to offer victims' families if they are affected. And there's been key reforms to financial support as well. So CTP, for example, still a lot to do there, but they have extended the deadline for initial claim from that, I think it was 28 days originally or 30 days originally, to 90 days now. So that came off the back of this research, that the webinar we did for them last year, which we're really happy about. It's only one small change of many that need to happen, but we're starting to see a little bit of progress, which is encouraging. And just in terms of reform, so as I'm sure you all know, there's a parliamentary inquiry and the Law Reform Commission review happening, which has been really critical to challenge the existing legislation and the way that these crimes are currently treated in our society and in our judicial system. So again, just the start of the process, but it's great to see people responding to the research and taking it seriously and thinking about what they can do to make much needed change. So that concludes our presentation. I just